What should be the goal of our grazing?
My premise basically is that the way nature does grazing is the right way. That's the grass and the animals have worked together over the eons to make the system work. But we do really need to actually look at some of these natural grazing systems.
Now, what will that look like in practice if we actually mimic natural system?
You've got this really strong pattern of the animals just wanting to go back to that good grass. Wherever that exists, that, you're going to have grazing lawns. For instance, in the Pacific Northwest, that was a grazing lawn. And that was kind of why I went there is like, this is a place where I know it's going to be those conditions. That is the sort of place that the animals always would have gone back to.
All that and more on this episode 475 of the Working Cows podcast, brought to you by Ranch Right and C90 Ocean Minerals.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows podcast, recorded exclusively in the C90 Ocean Minerals studios. Very excited to be joined once again by Nate Chisholm. Been a long time since I had Nate on, and he's made quite the change, quite the shift since then. He's moved to Kenya and has continued to observe and manage and see what's happening on the landscape, and Kenya provides a unique opportunity to see natural systems about as natural as they get, and he's been able to see some things confirmed there, and he's got a perspective on this idea called the Grazing Lawn that I wanted to talk to him about today, and we will have that conversation with Nate right after a word from our sponsor today, Ranch Right. Death, taxes, and paperwork. Ranch Right can help you avoid one of them. If you're a successful business, then you are probably paying some taxes. But that doesn't mean you have to be stuck inside preparing your paperwork for the accountant. Enlist the team of financial experts at Ranch Right to get you back outside doing more of what you love. They're committed to providing you with actionable financials so that you can build a profitable business and create generational wealth. While some things in life are inevitable, being mystified by your numbers doesn't have to be one of them. If you are ready to entrust the paperwork to a team that actually enjoys this kind of stuff, visit ranchrightllc.com and get back outside to the things you enjoy. Nate, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows podcast. It's been a long time.
Yeah, thanks, Clay. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, very excited for the conversation. I appreciate what you've been up to and kind of the just the dive in with both feet, move to Kenya, and go for it. So that it's been a kind of fun to watch from a distance, and I'm excited to kind of capture some of your story a little bit along the way. But what drew my attention to you most recently was a series of videos you did on, kind of trying to mimic nature more accurately. And so kind of maybe just break down in a couple of minutes what you are aiming at with those videos and what your premise is, and then we'll kind of talk about some of the ins and outs of it.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks again, Clay, for having me back on. So, my premise basically is that the way nature does grazing is the right way. That's the grass and the animals have worked together over the eons to make the system work. And so we do really need to look at that. And that's like there is a lot, everybody in the regenerative or the whatever the current term is going to be, movement, talks about mimicking nature, but we do really need to actually look at some of these natural grazing systems to see what's going on. And I can't, I'm I'm just a dude that's trying to move cattle around and is watching and looking at what's going on, and does have a geeky streak to like to read, science papers about it. But I can't, I can't claim to be an expert, and I honestly don't think that we have enough information. Like, it's amazing for the decades now that we've talked about mimicking nature in grazing. We have not done a very good job of going out and actually looking and collecting information that would be useful. And I think it would be great if we got some really good usable data about what, for instance, the Serengeti ecosystem is like. But we have enough information to know that some of the things that we're doing that we think are mimicking nature and that are regenerative are not quite exactly the way nature does it. And so, yeah, that's, a lot of it, if I just come down to start talking about, well, if, in my opinion, if you are increasing your stocking rate sustainably year on year, and you are increasing the number of plant species that you've got, then you're probably, whether you know it or not, mimicking something of what happens in nature. That's just, again, I can't unfortunately say definitively, but that's what I see out here, and that's what I've seen, going along. And, there's a lot of people who, by accident or by intuition, by art, do mimic nature, do a very good job of that. And, I probably used this example last time on my last podcast. It's like, it's great to have people who are just really intuitive, and can just be real good artists of grassland management. Just like, like we built great cathedrals before we knew about engineering, before Newton had laws. But we sure did a whole lot more stuff after we codified it, after we went out and we looked and we turned it from an art into it's not a science exactly, but it's an engineering, and so that we can use some of this information and make something that dependably works. And so, like, for instance, Bud Williams, who I cite a lot, he didn't look at African ecosystems. He didn't do any of that stuff, but he had a system that I've followed for a long time, and it works quite well. And, like, I guess I'll start talking about it by talking about, there's this place, if you look behind me, this is not a screen. This is my veranda. This is not a green screen or anything like that. If you look out right in here between these hills, there is a place on my neighbors where all the wild grazers go to whenever it rains. Whenever it rains, things start to come from all sides. I mean, first it's the zebras. The zebras are the biggest piece. And then also eland, which are they're antelope that are about the size of a cow, about the size of there's a very big antelope, and then smaller gazelle, and eventually the elephants and the buffalo all start to come right to this spot. Anytime it rains, the grass comes up, and the animals go there, and they turn it into a really dense, thick, lawn, grazing lawn. That's what some of the researchers, that's what one of the researchers, like one of the few pieces of science that have come out of the Serengeti that does provide information that's useful if you can handle, Greek alphabet and all kinds of crazy syntax. But so anyway, so it rains and the animals come to my neighbors there, and then they'll eat it down, but they don't take it all the way to the ground. But eventually, as as it starts to dry out, the animals move back out. They go back out into the taller grass that has been growing tall in the meantime. And like that is a pretty close approximation to what you see in a lot of this research. You see the animals going back to specific places on the landscape whenever there's grass there, for whatever reason, because it's open, because it's got good soil, because eventually, just because they always do, and then they keep the grass in high quality. And so you go out there, and the grass, let's try to get it on the screen, but it's a podcast too. So, it's about 12 inches, 18 inches high, and it's just really thick. And you go through and you just kind of wade out there, and they eat that, and they eat it down a little ways, and then they go back out into the tall stuff. And that's one snapshot of one way that animals operate in nature, right? And I'm sure there's many others, but for me, it's been a really useful way of looking at it, looking and seeing what the real thing is, and then trying to figure out different ways to manage for that, to incorporate that into the management. Because to me, when you look at the research, when you increase the production in grass by grazing it when it's green, right? And you graze it when it's green and vegetative, it comes back up green and vegetative, it comes back up green and vegetative, it comes back up green and vegetative until it dries up, right? And so, like, this research that I'm citing from Serengeti, on average, he did a comparison where he did excluded areas of the Serengeti and then just natural grazed areas, and then clipped to see what the grass production difference was between the exclusion areas and the wild natural grazing. And on average, the grazed plots were about almost twice as productive as the ungrazed plots. And that production came from grazing stuff when it was green and vegetative. Importantly, like the areas of the Serengeti, because there are areas of the Serengeti that it grows up as tall as it can get, and then the animals come through there and they eat it all the way down to the ground. And that does happen. It's a kind of a minority of the time that happens, but that does happen. The issue is, when in the Serengeti, those areas have there's the grazed and the ungrazed plots have the same production. Grazing is not increasing the production of those almost at all. And so, so then we have to stop and think, okay, what are we mimicking? In our regenerative practice, are we mimicking, like, there are places in the Serengeti, it's almost lucky for some, for some people, that there are actually places where that happens, because, but there are, but they are the least productive parts of the ecosystem. And so,
you're saying it's lucky for them because it's lucky for the gurus, because there are gurus who are saying that's how we should manage grasslands.
Well, and it is lucky because I don't know if they really looked. Like this research that was done in the 80s, like it's been out. All of the gurus could have looked at it, and so that's it. and it's, this is pretty spread wide, very far and wide amongst all the people who talk about this, is like, we just need to make sure that we are looking at that we're not just doing a thought experiment on some of these things, because we're going to learn a whole lot more when I can just, like what I'm doing, like pointing here, like this place right here, this is what we're mimicking, or this is what we're trying to mimic, or this is what we should be trying to mimic. And so, that being said, right, you have to have, for me, you have to have tall grass, and you have to have that sometimes. So, like, kind of the rule that I go off of is, you try to be in a grazing lawn as much as you can, but you have enough tall reproductive material that you're never going to run out. Okay. And so that's the balance that you are kind of trying to operate in. And when I've got tall material, I prefer to graze them at very high density, to knock that down. And so I guess it's sort of a hybrid kind of thing where we are trying to, I don't find any particular, like in nature, when that grass on those grazing lawns, the green, lush, thick, vegetative grass, they don't graze it particularly dense. They don't need to. It's extremely even. Like the grazing is very even. I've got pictures on my social media that people can check out to see some of this stuff. And I'll add some more after this podcast just to get it out there, because, when it's in that condition, they eat all of it, and, I had the same experience in Oregon. It doesn't, the cattle don't have to be extremely dense in order to maintain that grazing lawn. And so the ranch in Oregon is still operating. I've got a great guy who's running it. We're leasing it back from the people we sold it to. And, he showed him these pictures, or he saw them on social media, and he was like, that looks like Oregon, that looks like North Bank Lane. That looks like our pasture, and like, in a certain way, it couldn't be different, equatorial Africa and
Pacific Northwest.
Pacific Northwest, 5 miles from the Pacific Ocean. But the structure of that is so similar because you had such similar grazing regimes everywhere, and we know this, right? Like, we know that if given the whole world, these animals have the whole world to do whatever they want, they're not going to just keep eating the old dry stuff, right? When it rains, they're going to go back to the stuff that's good and green and lush. And they're not, like, we don't need to be, let me try to make sure I thread the needle on this. We need to see the wisdom in them going back, and we need to make sure that we're not creating artificial things that make that a problem. You know what I'm saying? So, like I say, they don't eat it way down to the ground. They don't go back there before it rains. They're out eating other stuff. I'll wait for you to catch up here.
Yep, there I am.
Okay, perfect.
So,
and so yeah, that is, like, instead of say, some people say, if the grass grows fast, you move fast. If the grass grows slow, you move slow. For me, I don't really like that. because, if the grass is growing fast, then you're moving too fast to create those grazing lawn conditions where you've got an even graze and things can come back vegetatively. And if you're going too slow, then you're just hammering everything into the ground, and it takes a really long time for it to get back. So the first thing is stock. You have your stocking rate so that you're not going to run out of grass, right?
Mhm.
So you can't be stocked so that, for the average year, because that means that half the years you're going to not have enough grass, right? That's what average is. And so you have to figure that in an average year, you just can't make it to all your grass. You can't do it. And so then instead of moves fast, grows fast, move fast, if it grows fast, go back to the first paddock that you started at. Say you've got 10 paddocks. You start in number 1, you graze that halfway, you move to the next one, you graze that halfway, and you start when it's very green and reproductive. If you've got fast growth conditions, go back to that first paddock, right, when it's recovered. And don't worry about all that other grass. That is great. It's sitting there and it's ready. Okay? So if it grows fast, go back to the first paddock. If it grows slow, go use that grass that you thought you'd never use. That stuff that you reserved and thought you'd never use. And that's Bud Williams. Bud Williams, he had no theoretical whatever, and
he had no dog in the fight, right?
He had no dog in the fight. He'd never been, he'd never been to Africa. He didn't ever think it was important, but he knew about that process. And what this does is it's like, oh, it's what they're doing, and so yeah, it's like I say, just balancing it between keeping them on a grazing lawn, short vegetative green grass as long as you can, and having enough tall, reproductive, or in whatever condition, having enough of that that you know that you're not going to run out. And that's going to be different, here, where, like I say, it can go years sometimes without rain. It looks great right now, right? But sometimes it doesn't rain for a few years. You want to be stocked accordingly. Whereas in Oregon, like we had dependable irrigation water all the time. I'm not gonna stock it so that I'm not going to use a third of my grass or something like that every year. That's just some of the things you got to,
right.
fathom.
So, yeah, would you say then that grazing lawns exist in every ecosystem?
They did. I would say that they probably did, because you've got this dynamic. You've got this really strong pattern of the animals just wanting to go back to that good grass, and so wherever that exists, that you're going to have grazing lawns. And like I say, I've managed a lot of different places, right? And so for instance, in the Pacific Northwest, yeah, that was a grazing lawn. And that was kind of why I went there, is like, this is a place where I know it's going to be those conditions. That is the sort of place that the animals always would have gone back to, right? And like in California, we didn't have rhizomatous runner grasses, and so it looked different than what this is, because this looks, it's a thick mat of runner grass. Like it's Bermuda, or it's the wild ancestor of Bermuda. And, in California, it didn't look like that because there wasn't runner grasses. Maybe there would be eventually. But it functioned the same way, even with the bunch grasses.
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, C90 Ocean Minerals.
C90 brings the power of sea energy agriculture to your farm or ranch. Using the principles discovered by Dr. Maynard Murray, C90 harnesses the power of the ocean to remineralize your soil, increase pasture nutrient density, and raise healthier livestock. C90 is perfect for all livestock and can help you unlock the genetic potential of your herd. Available nationwide at Tractor Supply, plus give their team a call to learn more about their new spore-based soil biological input and help take your soil fertility to the next level. Visit c-90.com or call 717-580-1458 today. C90, a wave of nutrition.
And I appreciate your, kind of statement about the intuition involved, and no one who's paid attention to Bud Williams' legacy should be shocked that his intuition was right. I think the guy's ability to observe things, natural systems, was probably second to none in our recorded history, and that's saying something.
I completely agree.
An incredible man.
Yeah, and I just as a tangent on that, one thing, it's discouraging to me seeing, as the decade, 13 years or 12 years since his death, seeing his legacy and seeing his knowledge just kind of start to just really diminish from our imagination. And I think that's a real unfortunate thing.
And I think I didn't know Bud, but knowing his personality as I think I do, I'm sure he taught us the thing that he thought was most important to teach us, right? Like, we need to fix the stockmanship issue.
Uh-huh.
And he had some ideas about grazing that he did talk about to people, and we need to help people market better,
Uh-huh.
But I'm sure, had he lived longer, he would have probably said, okay, we've got the stockmanship stuff, we've got the marketing stuff, let's talk about grazing more, or whatever. And so I think there's definitely,
and
there was more there than what we received, I would guess.
Yeah. He said at one point, he said, in 1959, I started doing the stockmanship stuff because I needed to figure out how to manage the pastures.
Yeah.
And he said that was the beginning. That was what started me down the road. And I think, I don't know, it's so hard to say because all these different places are so remote now, and so they've disappeared. But it seems like he was the best forage manager of all time.
So would you say then that these grazing lawns should be expanding, or we should just know that they exist in our ecosystem and manage them according to the way that they are designed to be managed? Or how would you think about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think first you got, you've got to make them, you're not going to find them in our world, in our modern world. They're gone. And so you make them, and you can make them in specific places, or you could scatter them around in time, like this number one paddock that I keep talking about, that could be the number one paddock this year, and then number 10 is the number one paddock next year. You can flip it around so that you rotate the grazing lawn all over the property. It's up to you. There's, for me, there's usually kind of practical reasons to have them in one place, but there's a great benefit in spreading that effect around. Like in Oregon, there was places that would flood, and so the grass would get tall, the canary would grow up through the water, and so that kind of naturally like relegated those to being the tall areas, or stuff like that. And it's the same way here. But you make those by bringing the animals back when it's recovered, which is a term of art, right? There's just a lot of art into knowing when something's recovered, when the grass is recovered. And I think that, for instance, that you got it wrong if you come back to something and you didn't hardly get the animal days that you expected, right? Or something like that, like I'm expecting to get 20, 30 animal days to the acre oftentimes in that sort of environment. And so if I get less than that, then I'm like, maybe I came back a little too early. I'll just push it. Now you've come but too late if you're starting to get reproductive material. If the animals are starting to selectively graze, if they're grazing patches, then that's an indication that you came too late. And so, and like different places, I've been enough places to know that different places it's harder and easier. At different times of year, it's harder and easier to keep the grass vegetative, right? Like in California, it was quite difficult. But and here it's sort of interesting because it's on the equator, there's no daylight difference, so you don't have spring, right? You never have like spring where there's like a monster of seed heads. The seed heads are generally pretty manageable, but you can get them all times of the year. Whereas in North America, generally there's times of the year where you don't have to worry about it. So just keep coming back to that. Don't let it, don't graze it down too far. Like I guess I'll tell a story about Bud for that. He would say, come back to it when it's ready. And he had just like a way of saying it that you knew that you weren't supposed to ask a question. Cause like, he wasn't like what can you tell somebody about, like, how do I know when I'm riding the bike right? How do I know, how to keep up from riding the bike? But yeah, you kind of try to keep in those parameters. And if you came too early, it's not going to be a big deal if you're paying attention, because you'll just give it more rest next time. And if you came too late, it's not a big deal. Just go two paddocks down and find the place where it's just right. So just start over. So I don't think we need to be really precious about these things, because let me tell you, the elephants and the buffalo and the rhinos and the everything are not particularly precious about it, right? And yet it works out just perfectly, because that's what the grass likes. That's what the grass is. That's what grass is. Grass is a grazing thing. It was built for grazing. And I think in certain ways in the regenerative movement, one of the problems is we don't trust grazing in a certain way. Like, we want it to look like it was never grazed, before we go there. And that's not really what grass wants. Grass can't handle that. Grass needs to be grazed. It likes to be grazed, and it likes to be grazed a certain way. But it doesn't feel exactly the same about it as we would feel if somebody came and bit our head off. So we just have to keep that in mind. But Yeah.
So a few different times throughout this conversation, you've said things to me that kind of remind me of my conception of Voisin's rational grazing, where he says, go where it's ready, rather
Right.
than say, okay, 1 paddock, 2 paddock, 3 paddock in succession. He says, go where it's ready. And I think that kind of like what you said earlier about a lot of people through intuition or whatever kind of came to some of these conclusions. And I think that probably, nobody has or had it all right. Like there's some people had this piece right, some people had that piece right. And the more we kind of synthesize all that material, we can get closer to what these natural systems were or can be, right?
Yeah. And I think, a lot of people have a really good intuition about it. And I would say a lot of people have an intuition about it that doesn't jive with some regenerative consensus. And again, judge them not on how many paddocks they have, how many times they move their animals, what their grazing chart, how cool their grazing chart is. Judge them on how much production they get and what the biodiversity is of the pasture. And so, I think that's another thing that we need in this movement. It can't be based off of practices like a government thing. Like, okay, you've checked this box, you've checked this box, you've checked this box. It has to be based on what you've done. And, like for instance, I tell so, like as a thought experiment, which I just dissed, but let's do one for a second. If you had a beautiful flat pasture outside of a feedlot or a dairy, and you don't like it's a good pasture, but it's a couple hundred acres or something. It's not gonna feed all the cattle. But what you're gonna do, because you don't want to mess with fences, is you're going to get some really great forage meter, and you're going to measure how much feed is on there. And every morning you're going to let out enough animals to eat the grass that was grazed the day before, or that grew the day before. So if you see what I'm saying, like you've got 5,000 head in the feedlot, you've only got a couple hundred, you'll let 200 head out one day, or you'll let 400 head out another day, or it didn't grow at all and you're not going to let any animals out until it grew again. That would be a really good, I predict that would work really well. And if stuff started to get away, just let all 5,000 head out, knock it all down and start over again. And, that doesn't pass muster in most regenerative, like in the Voisin tradition, it doesn't exactly pass muster, but it mimics this, it mimics what's happening here. And that's, that's the thing that counts. Uh, because like there is not we have not quite figured it all out, obviously. It like with Voisin and the theory of you've got to let the grass rest because the root reserves have gone and you're going to let it recover. It's kind of based on a hay model, on a cutting model. And like what I'm saying is if 20 days in a row you were letting 200 head out there onto that pasture, you would not be doing any harm. It's not necessarily the time that they're grazing on there that is the issue. It's, to me, it's more about the structure of the grass. And so, yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So let's talk a little bit about the biodiversity of these grazing lawns. Are they better than the surrounding areas then? And I mean, like all your key indicators for soil health, water infiltration and all those kinds of things. Are these grazing lawns, they're better than what surrounds them as far as those places where the tall grass is that they go back to when it's not raining?
That's a good question, and I just don't know. In terms of biodiversity, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if they're the most biodiverse because, like anywhere around the world, almost when you've got a preponderance of vegetation that's growing reproductively, you tend to not have as high a biodiversity. And so that's what we see here is, we've got all that we've got all that just mat of Bermuda, basically, and I'm not I'm I'm not sure that you would find the highest biodiversity there, honestly. I'm quite confident that if you expanded your net to include all the different grazing environments that they hit in a year, that would be the highest. But yeah, I think I'm almost tempted to just pay the guy who does my plant sampling to go to the neighbors to ask the neighbors if we could do that, because it would be super fascinating. Like one of the things, like in a drought, when they eat it all the way down to the ground and then it starts coming back, that's kind of when you see the highest biodiversity in a lot of ways. But, like I say, if you took your measure to include the whole basin from the top of the hills where the grass was tall to the foothills where it was, sort of intermediate, and then in these grazing lawns, I'm quite confident that you're going to have a very high biodiversity reading in that. But yeah, I was just saying before we got cut off that, yeah, I'm tempted to have the guy who does my plant monitoring just go over there, ask my neighbors if I can just go over there and sample that, because yeah, we just got to have that information. But it's just
Sure.
super fascinating.
Well, and then I think, kind of to your point that the biodiversity oftentimes is measured on a small scale. And if you had a large enough scale, it's obviously more biodiverse, and those, animals originally would not have had fences to compete with or contend with, and they would have probably, spanned a much larger area than most of us are managing. And so, there's some of that to take into account too, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I think, like, if you were to mix the grazing lawn throughout all your paddocks, then your plots would be, higher biodiversity. I would project, but I would also like point out that probably on the whole ranch, it's not going to change, because like you're getting those same things happening somewhere. But again, those are thought experiments, so we need some real information. But
appreciate that. So are there ideal places to start developing these grazing lawns? Like if you're going to say, I'm coming to this place, and there are, varying degrees of health and productivity. Are there places you're going to say, okay, I'm going to start developing a grazing lawn here. This is going to be paddock 1, and over here that's going to be paddock 10, and over there that's going to be the place that I just go when paddock 1 is done being vegetative? Do you have a sense of how to choose that place that you start?
I think if there's not like an obvious reason that it can't be, then it's good to mix it around. Mm-hmm. So, like if just to back up for a second to to make sure, like, say you have 10 paddocks, right? You start in paddock 1, you move through, you graze that halfway down. You graze it to the point where the grass and the cattle both agree that it's time for them to move on, right? Because like you give the animals a paddock, they will eat happily and then they'll stop. Like at a certain point in these environments, they'll stop in a vegetative, lush, nice, they'll stop. Okay. So instead of making them, just stand there and wait for 6 hours before they reluctantly take the rest, just move them to the next spot and do the same thing. And then, say in spring, by the time you get to the pasture, to paddock 4, it's time to come back to number 1, right? And so those first 4 paddocks are kind of your grazing lawn for that year, right? And you go through that through spring and early summer, and then it dries out. And then you move on to 5, 6, and 7. And at that point, depending on your environment and whatever, you might want to use high density, to graze that down. If you've got grass like this, like 4-foot high grass, it might make a lot of sense to graze that. I don't think, you don't necessarily have to, but I like to if I'm in that sort of environment. Okay. And so then you do that, but you never got to paddocks 9 and 10, right? So now, if you can, a great place to start next year is paddocks 10 and 9 and 10, right? Because you've got all that old material, the new stuff starts to come through there, and you kind of mix it up a little bit. And, that's, that works good here. Like in Oregon, in a very wet environment, old last year's growth is no good. It's less than no good, right? So again, like for me, the nice thing is that going all around the world doing this and kind of digging in for a few years in a lot of different places, you kind of start to get a sense of what is unique to a place, to a forage, to whatever, and what is kind of universal in grazing. What is something that just no matter what the animals were all through time, there was a very strong force that was creating this similar environment, so in that sort of world, like if you don't have a good reason to not make something a grazing lawn, I kind of might think just spread them around. That's what I kind of tend to do. And again, like this is the real world. It's not going to look exactly like my 10 block thing, but it's a mental thing. And Bud Williams also, when he told this to me, like I try to remember to say this, is like, he said, if I was to do it like that, this is how I would do it. And, again, he kind of discouraged, too many questions around that, but he would always say, like, I would never build a fence, like to manage pasture. I would just move the animals around. And so, but this communicates how that works when you move the animals around with these 10 pastures, for instance. So like I'm saying, there was some places that I just very rarely treated like grazing lawns in Oregon or here, that there's just sometimes there are reasons why it just doesn't make sense. I would tend to want that to be in a deep soil, flatter, more open environment. That's where the animals choose to do here. I guess in answering that question, I can describe what the animals choose. Here, part of it is a mistake, is an accident because of the way that fences, where I'm sitting is a corridor where the animals cross the road, so it's kind of a pinch point. So, like, they're just over the decades, the animals tended to graze that down short, and so then it would come back fresh, so then the animals wanted to go there. So, I don't think, but it is also, there's good water there, and it's flat, and there's good soil and that sort of thing. So, that just gives you the point I'm trying to make, is that there are certain things that are about the ground, but there's also just, you know, that's the first one outside the corral, and that's, the cattle came in, we chucked them out there because it was 10 o'clock at night, and we sure as hell weren't going to bring them somewhere else, and so that's just where we started. So there's a certain amount of that's okay too.
I would imagine some of what makes certain places chosen to be grazing lawns is by the animals is kind of that openness is good for seeing predators, right? Like you can see the predator coming from 500 yards away. We're good here.
And there's a feedback loop, right? So they figure, like, if I have a choice, I want to go somewhere where there's, because if we're sitting out here at 9 o'clock at night, we're going to hear lions, and so they want to be somewhere where it's open, and that happens. The other aspect of it is, by doing this, it becomes open, so that's part of the thing. They I don't know if you can really see.
Yeah.
If you're there.
Sorry. I'm here.
Let me try to find it. I can never do this effectively with, you can't really see. Can you see a line, like a very straight line where there's bush on one side? No. Anyway, there is behind me a very straight line where there's bush on one side and there's open on the other, and there's an elephant fence there where it just keeps the elephants out, and the other animals come and go, but they just have completely kept it. It's almost treeless, versus on the other side it's almost forest. So the fact that they're always coming back to this certain place also makes it open.
Right. Yep. So just in that specific scenario, the elephants would keep the trees pushed back if they were allowed to go in there, or
yes,
is it the opposite?
They certainly would.
Okay, that's kind of what
they certainly would.
Right.
And I don't know why.
Right.
Well, anyway, yeah.
Well, and ironically, maybe not ironically, but the what you describe as a grazing lawn would tend to be most people's hayfields in American agriculture.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So start creating your grazing lawn in the hayfield.
That would be a good place to start. I mean, like, on these ranches, like on a ranch where, you're making, 150 acres of hay. I don't know. I mean, maybe you can make that. I've never been able to make such a thing pencil, but it would be a fantastic grazing lawn, in general. So that's a great place to start.
Very good, Nate. I appreciate the time today. I just wanted to kind of capture an introduction to this idea and this way of thinking, and I think we've kind of done that. Is there some other major piece of this that we've kind of left on the table?
I don't know. I don't think so. We'll do it again. It's an evolving thing, just like the rest of this stuff. So hopefully we'll do it again sometime.
Yes. No, I would like that, especially when the book is ready, and we can point people in that direction, and before. So, yeah, I appreciate that. So, Very good. We'll have links to the show notes page, or in the show notes page, to your previous episode and some other things relevant to what you got going on. And I appreciate your time today. Thanks for joining me.
Great. Thank you, Clay. Take care.
Coming up next on the Working Cows podcast, I know I've got some in the tank. One of them is with Adam Lash about the advantage of being a first-generation operator. I might be able to squeak out another one with a speaker at the Rogue Food Conference. We'll see about that. Or we might go a different direction entirely. So just stay tuned, and we will be back again real soon with another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.